am Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm so excited to be talking to Jessie Mei Li all about the second season of Netflix's Shadow and Bone. And in starting off, obviously going into the first season, there were so many elements of world building visually, and you probably didn't have that much of an idea conceptually what a lot of scenes that you were performing in were going to look like on the fantasy side of things. And, you know, even things like how you were harnessing your power, which you really thought about the physicality, you didn't know what the effects were going to look like afterwards. And so going into the second season, how has that changed a lot of elements and a lot of aspects? Because even something like, you know, commanding the light and those aspects for Alina, I imagine are so different now with just that sense of comfort and knowledge that you have at this point.
Yeah, you're so right. I think, yeah, first season, I really didn't know what we were making, like truly. Because, you know, it's YA fantasy, you don't know, like, I guess what I wasn't sure about was the tone of it and things like that. And so I think coming back into season 2 and being like, okay, this is the show we're making. These are the people who watch it. This is, you know, these are the people who are super, super excited about it. And yeah, having met loads of fans of the show and things like that, that all kind of helped, you know, get back into it essentially. But yeah, all the magic stuff, because I remember in season 1, I had such a different idea of how it was going to look. So then when you actually watch it, it's like, oh, okay, you went with that thing. You know, I remember very, very specifically in season 1, you know, a lot of Alina's light stuff, I was imagining sort of like shooting beams, like torches almost. But then actually what they ended up going with was the, you know, these orbs of light and things like that. So that was really interesting to see, because obviously when I was doing something different in my mind, so knowing what the effects will look like completely changed how I approach these magic parts of it. And that is, doing the magic stuff is wild, you know. Just, we all get into, you know, giggles about it quite a lot, because, you know, you're doing such crazy shit. You know, you're just doing such mad things, and it's genuinely so exhausting doing all of the physicality of like having to draw energy from like within, you know. It's actually a bit of a workout. And I think the thing that I was quite happy with was the fact that, you know, friends who'd watched the show and things, they sort of, then when we're then talking about it, and I'm like, it's mad for me to think that you were just standing there in front of a green screen, you know, because it feels real. And I was like, well, that's the main thing, isn't it? If you don't question it, then we're doing our job properly with the magic stuff. So it was definitely, I learned a lot between the 2 seasons. And obviously Alina's magic kind of takes on a different feel to it in the second season. There's so much more about pain and trauma than there was in the first season. So that was another thing, another layer added to the, you know, building on this magic stuff. So yeah, it was tricky, but really fun.
But that idea of tone that you were touching upon is quite interesting as well, because in this season, one of the other aspects at play is you have all these scenes with Ben Barnes as Kirigan, but they're not set in the present reality. There's kind of like a meeting of minds where those are existing. And so did you think about the tonality of scenes like that, or how did you specifically find how the two of you wanted to play those moments?
Well, yes. So the relationship between those 2 characters is so different from how it is in the books. And I think in the books, there's a lot more. I mean, obviously with the show, it's a big ensemble show, and you've got to have enough time for everyone. So, you know, a lot of Alina's story got kind of cut down. And I think they made the decision that Kirigan was going to be more of like an out and out antagonist, rather than in the books, where there's a little bit more kind of, ooh, what's going on? There's still a bit of spice going on between them. There's more of a romantic feel to it in a way in the books. So they wanted to steer away from that, which I thought was an interesting choice. And yeah, it was so funny to go from the Kirigan and Alina of season 1 to then these complete arch nemesis, you know, these 2 people. Because a lot of the time, you know, it was quite interesting. So I remember reading the scripts, and especially in the first 2 episodes, when Alina and Kirigan meet each other in these sort of dreams, it was an interesting concept, because, you know, the first time we see Kirigan, he's in Alina's dream. He doesn't have the scars because it's her memories, and so much of it is like, it's not real. And then the bit when Alina's in Kirigan's dream and she's in her black kefta and she's behaving more like he does, you know, that was quite interesting to play, because it was like, oh, okay, so not only these two meeting in this sort of weird mind palace thing, but also you had to take into consideration that this is going on in Alina's subconscious and this is going on in Kirigan's subconscious. So there were subtle changes between the dynamic of those two scenes as well. So yeah, it was really interesting doing a lot of that. And it was great because it still meant that even though the characters aren't the same physical space, me and Ben were. So it was nice we got a lot of time to spend together as well, which is really fun. Because I was worried, I was thinking, oh, does that mean I'm not going to be working with Ben so much this season? But actually we had a lot of scenes together, so that was great.
With what you're bringing up in regards to the costumes there as well, there's really wonderful ways in which detailing and tiny minute elements of the costumes really track the different relationships. And like you said, even the version of, is she in his space or is he in her space, in terms of that kind of dreamscape space, you know, and even if it's just little inflections of gold or black. And you know, the relationships with Nikolai and Mal also feel very charted through Alina's costumes. And so how do a lot of those external elements really help you as you're navigating through and charting a lot of the trajectory for your character?
Yeah, the costume designer, Wendy, she's incredible. She's every costume has so much detail. A lot of what she did in season 2 was there's a lot of like color matching, which is really nice, because you have, you know, you've got like the twins and their matching colors, and then you have Mal and Alina starting off this season when they are more having a nice time together, and they're both in these matching sort of like rust and teal outfits, which Mal then wears for the rest of the season, but which in a way is quite nice because it shows that Mal's just consistently the same, but Alina changes so much through the season. So like you mentioned, she there's then like another shared kind of costume with Nikolai, you know, when she gets into her second army leader uniform. So yeah, it's funny. I don't think you realize until you're in the costume like how much it does affect your performance. And that's why we're just so lucky to have such an amazing costume team. I loved going to the costume department. It was just like running around and looking at all the new costumes and all the like Ketterdam ones I'd never seen before. And there's so much storytelling in the costumes that, you know, you can't ignore that. It's so very well done. Yeah.
One of the other aspects that I wanted to talk about a little bit is the element of tension for Alina, because she's a character who really holds so much inside of herself. And I've heard you talk a little bit about the physical aspect of even just physically holding that tension in a very different place in your body. And so I wanted to ask you about where in your body and where in your muscles you feel like you really kind of capture that essence of it for her.
Yeah, I think it was so interesting because I'm quite a sensitive person. I feel like my nervous system is very high frequency, and you know, so I tend to sort of tense up and things, but in very different places. And I feel like there was like a part of my back that I don't normally ever feel, even. But I'd come back from work and it was something about this. I think with Alina, you know, so I did a lot of, you know, character work for her, which, you know, I hope comes through in the show. I mean, obviously we have little time with her and in lots of ways, but you know, I think you know, this need for her to sort of curl up and kind of hide away from things, that's so ingrained in sort of the backstory that I created for her and was in the writing already. So it's interesting. It's sort of this hunching, but then also having to sort of like, she's trying so hard to not do that and to be strong and powerful. So it's all this like constant kind of like push pull in the body. And just the fact that, you know, although in season 2, you know, Alina is so much more powerful and she's more self-assured and things on the surface, I think like what was important to me was that it felt that she's trying, you know, she's really trying to be like authoritative. She's really trying to be all these things. And it genuinely, I think it's mad. I think when you spend so much time as someone else, how much it can really physically affect you. And being Alina in season 2 had a massive effect on my my physiology, my whatever, my physiology. I can't even say the word, that thing.
With what you're talking about there in terms
yeah.
with what you're talking about there as well in terms of character work, obviously the first season's the deepest dive because you're really figuring out everything from scratch, and so given that you were touching upon that, was there character work and details that you wanted to kind of dive into and really map out for her differently this season, or was it really just about building upon the foundation of everything that you'd already created in your performance?
Yeah, I think it was definitely wanted to build upon what there already was, because she went on a bit of a journey in season 1, and she starts off as such a, I really wanted, because I think a character like Alina, she's a reluctant, frightened, like I don't belong here, don't look at me. It's quite hard to make that character likable, and it's quite hard to when someone is so closed off. It's quite difficult to then also show enough that the audience understanding like what she's going through. So yeah, I think we built up like an interesting ending for her for season 1, and then it was just all about adding to it. And so much of, like I mentioned, the themes for season 2, a lot of it was about trauma and overcoming trauma, and so I felt it was really important that felt legit, and it's tricky as well, because obviously I was at the time thinking, well, at the same time, this is a fun fantasy show, and it's not like a gritty character study, so it's kind of like fighting against the impulse to sort of give this performance that feels very real, but then also I'm thinking in the back of my mind, well, is this going to read in this context, and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think it was, I really liked what happened with Alina, because just in terms of, I'm so fascinated by people, like by human beings, and how we end up how we are. And I see Alina so much as a real person who has been ostracized, who's never believed in herself, and so of course that she's going to be spiky and difficult, and so it was interesting, because there still was then always in the back of my mind thinking, are people still going to like her? But hopefully I feel like there's a couple of scenes where we actually get a moment to like sit with Alina and her feelings and her thoughts, and those are my favorite to film, because it's nice to have a moment just to like see into this very closed off character's inner world. So yeah, those scenes are really, really great and so well written. So that was super exciting, doing those bits.
With what you're talking about there in terms of her always keeping a lot of her emotions under the surface and some of the challenges that come to that, what's great though is that we do get the opportunity to see what it looks like when she does gradually open up a little bit of herself to people. I think Patrick Gibson's character Nikolai is the perfect example of, at the beginning, she doesn't trust him at all. She's not allowing him to see anything beyond the facade. And then by the end, they have this real sense of emotional trust with one another. There's a closeness, there's a genuine friendship. And so as you're developing dynamics like that and relationships, how do you determine for her, how much of herself is she going to allow to the surface? How much is she going to allow her feelings to be seen? And what are the aspects that she's still always just going to keep under the surface for herself?
Yeah, I see Alina as like, she's one of these people who I think that fear of, something that I myself as well like struggle with, like fear of rejection, especially if you felt rejected a lot, which, in my mind, this character spent her whole life being rejected by everyone. And I think what was going through my mind with Nikolai was that even though he gets her heckles up at first, like often sometimes someone in real life that you meet and you have really good chemistry with them, you might not like them at first because there's something about them that there's a truth there, or there's a shared kind of understanding of something. And I think the fact that Nikolai sees Alina, like I think she feels very like seen by him in a way that is quite invasive for her at first, which is why she's got this big guard up and she doesn't like him and everything. But then over time, that kind of hand out, like, I see you and I see that you are important, you're the sun summoner, blah 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 blah. That gives her the invitation, this frightened, nervous girl, an invitation to be like, okay, you're safe. I sort of see her like a sort of skittish animal, like a wild animal that you've got a little handful of oats for, and that's what he did. He like reached out to her. And I felt that was quite a realistic relationship for the two of them. Yeah.
In that vein as well, her relationship with power is quite interesting, because she's not someone who's seeking to be a leader to other people, and yet that constantly ends up being the space that she's being pushed into, and people naturally really gravitate towards her, follow her, and trust her. And it felt like you had these little inflections of moments where you kind of allowed her to enjoy that a little bit more this season. The first season, any of those moments were quite challenging for her because it's so outside of her natural comfort zone. And so what was the difference that you wanted to capture this season in allowing her to kind of enjoy it a little bit more and find the aspects of it that she does feel comfortable with?
Yeah, well, Alina in the books is quite different in some ways. I mean, I hopefully carried over a lot of her characteristics, but I think in the book she still very much struggles with I'm not this idol, I'm not a saint, but I think again adding this, like, they wanted to add more to the character in terms of her backstory and her heritage and all of these things. So I felt like, of course, many aspects of her personality are going to change, and I think obviously it's in the work, it's in the script that, for example, at the last shot of season 2, I think the line was something along the lines of, Alina does the cut and then she's looking horrified, but then is that pride? Question mark. So, kind of have to like work back from that in some ways, because if that just happened without any lead up, it would feel really out of character. And so my thinking was that, again, she has been someone who's been so powerless. And while there is a world where Alina could have continued to be this, I don't want to be powerful, I don't want this. I like the idea that actually she's a human being who is flawed and who wants to be powerful, wants to be heard, and all of these things. And actually, so I thought it was important for her to revel in that power a little bit, because I thought it'd be more interesting that way than to just have her constantly saying she doesn't want any of this. And because there's only so many times a protagonist can say that, I think. So, and I like the idea that again, because it's always coming back to this trauma and her past and everything, and yeah, there's a world where the protagonist could have just continued to be this saintly, I'm such a good person, but I like that she's flawed and maybe a bit dangerous. I think it's more of an interesting, it's more of an interesting story for me. So yeah, that was interesting, like working out how to sort of, yeah. Yeah.
And with the fact that she has to kind of take on additional amplifiers, and we get to see that shift in that trajectory of when she takes on the second amplifier after season 1, it's such a different moment and such a different experience for her. And then it feels like the way that she harnesses her power after that, obviously, has to really evolve to that. But even just emotionally, it's a very different space for her. She describes how she feels really different with that inside of her body than she did with just the first one. And so what did you want those changes to be?
Well, yeah, so in the script, so season 1, her amplifier was all about power. So the stag sort of represents like power and strength. And so in the first season, I was, in terms of her body language and things, I think like she starts off she's always quite wobbly. I was quite wobbly on my feet. And then by the last 2 episodes, I wanted her to be still, steady. So then when we get into season 2 with the sea whip, for example, that is the amplifier that represents rage, and which was really interesting. I like the fact that they were bringing in all these different things, and obviously the last amplifier signifies love. And yeah, I really wanted there to feel like there was a shift between these different amplifiers. Like for example, things about Alina in terms of when she's had her sea whip amplifier, I wanted her to feel a little bit more like a predator. Actually, there's a couple of scenes, it's quite funny watching it back, where so I wanted her to have this like unwavering eye contact with people that she didn't have before. So that was quite interesting to play, and again that also brought up different sort of physicality, like different things with my face and voice, in order to sort of, I didn't want it to be too over the top, but like a subtle hint, like, okay, this is changing her. Because one of the main things that they talk about in Alina's storylines, that Merzost, the dark magic that they use, has a price. and I wanted it to feel like maybe something was being taken away from Alina, like her innocence, or that sort of sunny disposition that you might see in the beginning of season 1. I want it to feel like that's being drawn away from her, and hopefully that comes through, because it's not necessarily said ever. It's not like again, like I said, we don't have a lot of time to talk about these things, but I wanted it to feel like each time she gets one of these amplifiers, it changes her, but maybe not necessarily for the better. So that was interesting.
On the other side of things, there's also the development and the evolution of her relationship with Mal. And you and Archie kind of really beautifully capture those elements of two people who've known each other for so long, who have been family to one another. And even just the sense of how do we navigate through this, which if you strip away all the fantasy elements, it's the two of them in a room going, oh gosh, there's only one bed, what do we do? Because all of a sudden it's this completely new kind of space. And so how did the two of you work together to really find those moments of what spaces does the comfort that they've always had still continue to exist? And then what are some of the spaces where they're still kind of having to like re-navigate themselves around one another?
Yeah, well, I think what was nice is the fact that I felt like Mal and Alina did really feel like two people who knew each other really, really well. And I think luckily for me, having Archie as a scene partner, he's so brilliant. And Mal is so not like Archie in any way. But I feel like I know Mal really well. And so in a lot of the scenes, it's quite funny actually, because every actors have different processes, and it's great being in Shadow and Bone, be able to work with so many different people who work in so many different ways. But it's like Archie and I rarely ever talked about work, as in we rarely talked about like, okay, what's this scene going to be like, blah, blah, blah. We would just sort of turn up and then just exist as these two characters, and always feeling this, they're always being drawn together. We never spoke about it, but even just in scenes that we'd often look at each other exactly the same point or whatever in the scene. And honestly, I think so much of it was kind of like this unspoken understanding between me and Archie of our characters, and that they needed to feel like, I think it was important for them to feel like one entity in some ways, because that is what he is to Alina. He's so much a part of who she is, which is why then the decision at the end for them to go their separate ways was such a huge deal, because I didn't know that was going to happen until we were filming. And I was like, oh, okay, cool, so we're working towards this, because initially my thought was when we're reading scripts, I'm like, they're kissing in the first episode, whoa, hang on, like this is moving really fast. But it's because we needed to show this relationship and how much Alina like relies on him, in order for that sort of that ending choice to be as significant as it is. But yeah, no, honestly, I just feel really blessed, because I mean, with all of the cast, they're amazing actors to work against, and it's so much fun, and we try loads of different things. But yeah, I think the Alina and Mal relationship, it felt to me like these two people, the kind of people who could sit in a room together in silence and have the best day, and that's the feeling I wanted to have for them.
I love that. And in talking a little bit about spoilers right at the end of the season, I did want to ask about that kind of scene where she's faced with so many different things. It's absorbing the third amplifier. It's, losing Mal right in front of herself. And then it's also having to face Kirigan all in that same moment. And so how did you approach going into a scene like that, that's so complex, and especially with just the added element of knowing that's kind of the final tonality of the season for people?
Yeah, that was that was a lot. And we were filming in the most outrageous heat as well, which was just exhausting. Because I mean, this was 2 seasons of build up for Alina, and there's lots of other things that come into it, like the fact that after Alina destroys the fold, and obviously while in the show, in the final product, we're sort of cutting between Alina in this big moment and the fight scene that's going on at the same time, but the idea is that she's so completely exhausted, from just destroying the fold. It's almost like you're so spent, you're in shock. which was interesting because again, like very, very different from the books. And you know, obviously then killing Kirigan, again, very different from how it goes in the books. In the books, I think he dies in her arms, and it's almost quite touching. Whereas, you know, again, they're coming from the angle of this is a man who abused you. So, you know, there's like a shot at the end where Alina's just looking down at him. And I think that the choice was made to she's just looking, because she's completely in shock. I imagine this is the thing you've been building up to for so long. So yeah, I mean, poor girl, she's been through a lot. She just needs a hug. A hug and maybe a fan, because it was so bloody hot after destroying the fold. Yeah, so that was quite a big moment. And I just remember this was towards the end. This was probably one of the last weeks that we were filming those scenes, and I barely remember even shooting them, to be honest. I was so tired. But I think I really liked the changes that they made. It was very interesting, like the angle they were coming at, and obviously opening up to, you know, more story down the line possibly. So yeah, that was cool.
And in terms of your work overall as an actor, you've talked a little bit about how going into shooting the first season of this, that at the time you'd wish that you'd had the chance to have more formal training before going into a project like this. But obviously now you've had 2 seasons under your belt. And I was interested in, what are some of the things that you feel like you've really had the opportunity to learn and absorb through working on a show like this, that you feel like even through formal training, like nobody could have taught you or prepared you for?
Oh, I mean, people do say that, you know, you can go to drama school and things, but you'll never actually be prepared for the realities of filming and or theatre work. But I think a lot of the stuff with filming, you know, it's incredibly high pressure scenarios you find yourself in, because, you know, you think about all the money that's being spent and all the crew who are exhausted, and you've just got to get this shot. We've only got 2 takes or whatever it may be. That side of things, I don't really think you can teach that. I think it is very much, you know, about what you have to learn. I mean, there's so many, I feel like I've definitely grown a lot as an actor. Like I said, you know, I'd done a bit of, like, you know, National Youth Theatre, you know, like 4 weeks course, and a couple of acting classes. So I mean, I really felt sort of out of my depth in lots of ways, but also then I felt like, no, do you know what? I think I can do this, you know, this seems to be working. But genuinely, so much of what I've learned, it's more about the day-to-day of being on set, and, you know, being an actor, looking after yourself. Like, that is a lot of the takeaway for me has been about self-care and having boundaries and things like that. That's stuff that you don't learn, you don't get taught that. So that's been really, really helpful. I think, especially on a show like Shadow and Bone, that is so intense. It's filmed in, for what it is, it's filmed in such a short amount of time. You know, the time pressures are really, really on. So it is kind of like frying pan into the fire, you know, with that stuff. But there's lots of things, you know, I'd love to do more theatre. You know, I think things like in the first season, you know, again, I remember they really wanted, our first block director especially really wanted like an element of like naturalism. I was like, I can do that, you know, but then obviously then watching it back and thinking, okay, actually there's naturalism and then there's mumbling. So maybe there's a happy medium to be struck between those two, and things like that. So it's nice. It's nice to be able to like look back and think like, oh, okay, like, I can see what you're doing there, but now you know how to approach that a bit better or whatever. And I think that's just really exciting, you know, the idea that every job you learn something. So yeah, I don't necessarily feel so much like I'm completely behind. But I would love to do, maybe I just should go and do some fun little workshops. Why haven't I done that? Maybe I'll just do some fun workshops, you know, because I mean, I'd love to do more comedy and stuff like that as well. But it's just building up that confidence and that, you know, no, I know I've got this. I can definitely do this. Yeah.
Well, I always really, really love watching your performance in the show. So thank you so much, Jessie. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.